I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning to the shrill beeping of my temperature alarm. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. My phone showed the greenhouse temperature had plummeted to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, dangerously cold for the hundreds of seedlings I'd been nurturing for weeks. I threw on a jacket and sprinted across my backyard, flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. When I yanked open the greenhouse door, I was hit with air that was far too cool and the eerie silence where the familiar hum of fans should have been. Everything was off, the heating system, the circulation fans, the irrigation timers, all dead. I immediately checked the digital controller panel, the one I'd installed last summer after saving for months. The display was completely dark. This sophisticated system had cost me nearly $2,000, money well spent to regulate everything from humidity levels to nutrient delivery schedules. Each plant variety had specific needs programmed into the system. Tomatoes required different conditions than lettuce, peppers different from herbs. The technology had allowed me to triple my output over the previous year, meaning more fresh food for families who desperately needed it. Now, that carefully calibrated ecosystem was rapidly deteriorating. I frantically checked the circuit breakers, the wiring, the backup battery system. Nothing made sense. The power had been deliberately cut. As I stood there watching condensation form on the glass walls, I felt a sickening dread wash over me. Those plants weren't just my hobby, they were destined for the Community Hope Food Bank, where dozens of families relied on fresh produce that was otherwise unaffordable. 2 years of careful planning and community service was now in jeopardy because someone had deliberately turned off the power to my greenhouse, and I had a sinking feeling I knew exactly who that someone was. My hands trembled in the cold as I pulled out my phone and called Walter, the retired electrician who lived 3 doors down and had helped me set up the greenhouse initially. Despite the ungodly hour, he answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep but immediately concerned when I explained the situation. "I'll be right over," he promised, and true to his word, his porch light came on less than 5 minutes later. As we worked to assess the damage in the frigid darkness, Walter discovered that the main electrical conduit had been tampered with professionally, not just switched off, but partially dismantled in a way that would make it difficult to prove malicious intent rather than mechanical failure. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing, Walter muttered, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. This wasn't random vandalism. Someone wanted to make it look like a system failure. That confirmed my suspicions. This wasn't just casual sabotage, it was calculated to cause maximum damage while providing plausible deniability. I'd moved to Meadowbrook Estates 3 years ago, drawn by the large lots and sunny exposure perfect for gardening. The homeowners association rules seemed reasonable at first, standard restrictions on paint colors, lawn maintenance, and holiday decorations. What I hadn't anticipated was how seriously some residents took those rules, particularly our newest board chair, Beverly Sterling. She'd been elected 6 months ago on a platform of neighborhood standards and property values and had been making everyone's lives difficult ever since. Before Beverly took over, the homeowners association had operated with a light touch. The previous president, a gentlemanly history professor named Richard, had focused on community building rather than rule enforcement. Under his leadership, we'd started neighborhood cookouts, a book exchange in the community clubhouse, and even a scholarship fund for local high school students. The community had felt like an actual community, neighbors looking out for one another rather than policing each other's choices. Beverly's elevation to board chair came during a period of unusually low attendance at homeowners association meetings. Most of us were busy with our lives, trusting that the reasonable governance would continue. The election happened on a rainy Tuesday evening when barely 20% of homeowners showed up to vote. Beverly had arrived with a contingent of her closest allies, mostly retirees concerned about their property investments and a few younger professionals who viewed their homes primarily as assets rather than places to live. They had voted as a bloc, and just like that, the character of our community governance changed overnight. I still remembered Richard's sad smile as he handed over the meeting gavel, almost as if he could foresee the trouble ahead. My troubles with Beverly began shortly after I expanded my small hobby garden into a proper greenhouse. I'd built it according to county regulations, obtained the proper permits, and even matched the trim color to my house as required. The structure wasn't visible from the street, tucked away in my backyard behind a row of ornamental shrubs, but that hadn't stopped Beverly from finding fault with it. First came complaints about the delivery trucks bringing soil and supplies, then about the occasional volunteers who helped on weekends. Each time, I patiently explained that I was within my rights according to both county zoning and homeowners association bylaws, showing her the relevant documentation. What Beverly didn't seem to grasp, or perhaps didn't care about, was the purpose behind my greenhouse. It had started small, just a way to grow extra vegetables for myself and neighbors. But when I donated some surplus tomatoes and cucumbers to the local food bank 2 years ago, the director had nearly cried. "Do you know how rarely we get fresh produce?" she had asked. "Most donations are canned or box goods, and their clients desperately need fresh, nutritious options." That day changed everything for me. I began researching high-yield gardening methods, installed proper grow lights, and designed an efficient watering system. Within months, I was providing over 50 pounds of fresh produce weekly to the food bank. The community response had been overwhelmingly positive. Local families who used the food bank would stop me at the grocery store to thank me. Several neighbors even volunteered their time or donated seeds and supplies. The local paper ran a small feature about community-sustained agriculture, featuring my greenhouse as an example of neighbors helping neighbors. Everyone seemed to appreciate the effort, everyone except Beverly and her small circle of homeowners association purists. As I stood in my rapidly cooling greenhouse that night, using my phone's flashlight to examine the main power connection, I discovered something disturbing. The waterproof junction box had been tampered with. Someone had intentionally disconnected the power cables and carefully replaced the cover. This wasn't an accident or power outage, it was deliberate sabotage. I immediately began emergency measures, connecting battery-powered heaters and calling a few neighbors who had previously volunteered. By dawn, we'd managed to stabilize the temperature, but I knew many sensitive seedlings wouldn't survive the shock. The next morning, blurry-eyed from my sleepless night, I found an official-looking notice taped to my front door. It was printed on Homeowners Association letterhead and cited 3 alleged violations related to my greenhouse: unauthorized commercial activity, excessive utility usage creating a burden on neighborhood infrastructure, and creating nuisance conditions affecting neighbors' enjoyment of their property. The notice gave me 72 hours to cease all greenhouse operations or face daily fines of $100. It was signed by Beverly Sterling, Homeowners Association Board Chair. My hand shook with anger as I read the notice. None of these alleged violations had any basis in reality. I wasn't selling anything, all produce went to charity. My utility usage was entirely on my own meter and actually quite efficient. And the only nuisance was in Beverly's imagination. I immediately called several board members I had friendly relationships with, but none answered. Later, I learned Beverly had convened an emergency executive session the previous evening, excluding board members she suspected might side with me. Over the next 2 days, I watched helplessly as many plants began to wilt despite our emergency measures. The cold snap had damaged more than half my seedlings, representing hundreds of hours of work and thousands of meals that wouldn't reach families in need. Each dying plant felt like a personal failure, though I knew the true blame lay elsewhere. The food bank director called, concerned about the sudden reduction in deliveries, and her disappointment only deepened my resolve to get to the bottom of this. I had a security camera mounted on my back porch, primarily to deter wildlife from destroying my garden. It hadn't occurred to me to check the footage until my neighbor Marcus suggested it. "If someone messed with your power," he reasoned, "you might have caught them on camera." That evening, I scrolled through the previous night's footage. At first, I saw nothing unusual until 1:47 in the morning. A figure with a flashlight approached from the side of my house, heading directly to the power junction. The image was grainy in the low light but unmistakable: Beverly Sterling, still wearing the blazer she'd had on at yesterday's neighborhood watch meeting, deliberately disconnecting my greenhouse power. I sat staring at my computer screen, a mixture of vindication and fury washing over me. I had proof now, but what should I do with it? Call the police? Confront Beverly directly? I opted for a more strategic approach. First, I documented everything: the damage to my plants, the falsified homeowners association violations, the security footage, and an estimated impact on the food bank's distribution. Next, I reached out to families who had benefited from the greenhouse program, asking if they'd be willing to share what the fresh produce had meant to them. The response was overwhelming and humbling. Single parents, elderly residents on fixed incomes, a family caring for a child with special dietary needs, all wrote heartfelt testimonials about how access to fresh vegetables had made a meaningful difference in their lives. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. Armed with this documentation and community support, I requested an emergency open meeting of the full Homeowners Association Board. According to our bylaws, any homeowner could call such a meeting with the support of 5% of residents. I had signatures from nearly 20%. Beverly tried to block the meeting on procedural grounds, but the Homeowners Association's own attorney advised that would expose them to potential legal action. The meeting was scheduled for 7 o'clock the following evening in the community clubhouse. Word spread quickly, and by 6:30, the room was packed. People I'd never seen at Homeowners Association meetings before, young families, elderly couples, even renters who technically had no vote, filled every chair. The food bank director arrived with several volunteers and clients who had benefited from the greenhouse produce. Beverly looked increasingly uncomfortable as the crowd grew, huddling with her few allies in a corner. When the meeting began, she tried to limit discussion to 3 minutes per speaker and exclude non-owners, but was quickly overruled by the overwhelming majority present. I spoke first, calmly presenting the facts. My greenhouse was fully permitted, operated solely for charitable purposes, and harmed no one. I outlined the careful steps I'd taken to comply with all regulations, showing photos of the unobtrusive structure and documentation of county approvals. Then, I revealed the security footage. The room fell silent as the video clearly showed Beverly approaching my property in the middle of the night and deliberately cutting the power. This act of vandalism, I stated, damaged over 500 plant starts destined for the community food bank and will result in approximately 3,000 meals not reaching families in need this month. Beverly jumped to her feet, face flushed. That greenhouse is an eyesore and a violation of our covenants. I was acting in the best interests of all homeowners and property values. Her voice rose shrilly as scattered boos erupted from the audience. It's a commercial operation on residential property. The constant traffic of those people coming to help is disrupting our peaceful neighborhood. The slip revealed her true objections more clearly than anything else could have. The food bank director rose next, a dignified woman in her 60s who had dedicated her life to fighting hunger in our community. She commanded immediate respect. Those people Beverly refers to are your neighbors, she said quietly. Some are volunteers who give their time freely to help others. Some are recipients who prefer to contribute labor rather than accept charity passively. All are part of this community. She then introduced several food bank clients who bravely shared their stories: a laid-off construction worker supporting 3 children, an elderly couple whose medical bills left little for groceries, a young mother whose husband was deployed overseas. One by one, neighbors I had barely spoken to stood up to defend the greenhouse project. Marcus from down the street described how his children had learned about sustainable gardening while volunteering. Mrs. Johnson, a retired teacher, explained how the greenhouse provided educational opportunities for local schools. Even Mr. Rivera, who I knew had initially complained about delivery trucks, stood up to say he'd changed his mind after learning about the program's impact. The mood in the room shifted palpably from anger at Beverly's actions to something more constructive, a community recognizing its own power to help its most vulnerable members. Someone suggested taking a collection to repair the damage to the greenhouse. Another proposed establishing a formal community garden program under homeowners association protection. A third recommended removing Beverly from her position for abuse of power and potential criminal mischief. That motion was quickly seconded. The atmosphere in the clubhouse was electric now, charged with purpose and possibility. People who had lived as neighbors for years but barely spoken were suddenly engaged in animated conversation, exchanging phone numbers and making plans. Mrs. Chen, who taught biology at the local high school, offered to bring her students to help rebuild the greenhouse. The owner of a local hardware store promised materials at cost. Even the usually taciturn Mr. Gunderson, a retired military officer who rarely participated in neighborhood events, stood up to announce he would donate his entire backyard, nearly a quarter-acre of prime southern exposure, to expand the community growing program. What was unfolding before me was nothing short of revolutionary for our little suburban enclave. For too long, our neighborhood had existed as a collection of private properties rather than a true community. People drove into their garages, closed the doors behind them, led separate lives despite their physical proximity. Yet here we were, suddenly imagining a different way to live together. I watched as natural leaders emerged from the crowd, not those who had sought power like Beverly, but those with genuine skills to contribute. The retired landscape architect sketching possible garden expansions on a napkin, the event planner discussing logistics for a fundraiser, the accountant offering to set up a proper non-profit structure for ongoing operations. Beverly, seeing the tide turning dramatically against her, attempted one last defense. "I was just enforcing the rules we all agreed to when we bought our homes," she insisted, her voice now tinged with desperation. "The greenhouse violates Section 8, Paragraph 3 of our covenants regarding accessory structures." But her argument fell flat as another board member, a retired attorney, pointed out that the same section included exemptions for structures serving community benefit, a provision specifically added years ago to allow a neighborhood playground. The final vote was decisive. The Homeowners Association board voted unanimously, with Beverly abstaining, to formally recognize my greenhouse as a community benefit project exempt from certain covenants. They additionally approved emergency funds to repair the damage and upgrade the systems to prevent future failures. Most significantly, they voted 8-1 to remove Beverly as board chair for actions detrimental to community harmony and potentially exposing the association to legal liability. As a stunned Beverly gathered her things and stormed toward the exit, someone began to applaud. The applause spread until the entire room was standing in ovation, not for me, but for what the community had accomplished together. What happened next exceeded all expectations. A reporter who lived in the neighborhood had attended the meeting and found the story compelling enough to feature on the local news. The segment aired the following evening, highlighting not just Beverly's actions and subsequent removal, but the broader story of community resilience and mutual aid. Viewers responded immediately. By morning, the food bank had received donations from across the city. A local nursery offered to replace all damaged seedlings free of charge. A solar company proposed installing panels to make the greenhouse energy independent. Most surprisingly, 3 neighboring homeowners associations reached out about starting similar programs in their communities. The story continued to spread, catching the attention of regional media outlets. A prominent morning show invited me to appear as a guest, but I suggested they feature the food bank director instead. She was far more eloquent about the real issues of food insecurity in our supposedly affluent county. Her appearance sparked a county-wide conversation about hidden hunger in suburban communities. Statistics that had previously been ignored suddenly became front-page news. 1 in 7 children in our county experienced food insecurity. Nearly 20% of seniors skipped meals to afford medications. Countless families were just one missed paycheck away from hunger. Perhaps most significant was how the incident transformed our homeowners association itself. The board, now led by Richard, who had reclaimed his former position, established a community welfare committee with actual decision-making power. The committee's first action was to survey residents about their needs and skills. What could each person contribute? And what did each person need? The results revealed neighbors who could teach gardening but needed help with home repairs, retirees with carpentry skills but limited mobility, young families with energy to volunteer but needing child care. The committee began matching these complementary needs, creating a neighborhood resource exchange that benefited everyone. Beverly, for her part, had retreated into seclusion. Rumors circulated about legal action she might take, but nothing materialized. The county prosecutor had declined to press charges for the power tampering, citing insufficient evidence despite the video footage. Some neighbors advocated for pursuing civil damages, but I chose a different approach. With the board's blessing, I sent Beverly a formal invitation to attend the greenhouse reopening ceremony. The invitation came with a handwritten note: "We all make mistakes when we forget we're part of something larger than ourselves. Your expertise and organization could be valuable to our community efforts. The door remains open." She never responded directly, but the certified letter was signed for and received. With power restored and community support stronger than ever, we worked day and night to salvage what plans we could and restart others. Neighbors I had never spoken to showed up with seedlings they had started at home. Local restaurants donated compost materials. And nearby college sent horticulture students to volunteer. Within 2 weeks, the greenhouse was not only operational again but improved with new heating systems, better insulation, expanded growing capacity, funded entirely by community donations. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. The most unexpected visitor came early one morning as I was checking the newly installed solar backup system. I heard a hesitant knock on the greenhouse door and turned to find Kevin Miller, one of Beverly's closest allies on the board and a frequent critic of my gardening efforts. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, holding a flat of tomato seedlings. "I started these at home," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Thought maybe they could help replace some of what was lost." He glanced around at the thriving greenhouse, now bustling with activity. "I never realized. I didn't understand what you were doing here. Beverly always made it sound like you were just breaking rules for the sake of it." He set down the seedlings carefully. "My mother relied on a food bank after my father left. I had forgotten that until I heard those families speaking at the meeting." He finally looked directly at me. "I'd like to help, if you'll have me." I showed him where to place the seedlings and handed him a spare pair of gardening gloves. Sometimes the most important growth happens not in the plants we tend, but in the community we build.